Hello and welcome to Mindfulness Voyage. My name is Ted Meissner. Glad you could be here. And before we get started, if you would please remember to subscribe to the podcast because it does help other people find this as well. Now, you may have lost friends or loved ones during COVID, and it may be something that is still echoing in your heart and mind. Research is now coming out about the effects of mindfulness influence on how we are responding to COVID. But that's not just what I want to talk about in our session today, our podcast today, but also how we visualize that data and important steps moving forward in the research of mindfulness. So let's get started. Our guest today is Quinn Conklin. Quinn, welcome to the podcast. Good to see you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And it's so interesting. We were having a conversation before the recording started, and I'm wondering if you could tell a couple of stories. First is just a brief overview of who you are, and then you told a really interesting story about what brought you into the work that you're doing now. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. I am currently a researcher studying contemplative practices, but also connections between psychological and biological functions. And I did my training at UC Davis. My PhD is in experimental psychology at UC Davis with Cliff Sarin, and that's one of the stories I can circle back to. And then I did a postdoc at UCSF with Alyssa Epple, who has also been a mentor since I started in Cliff's lab back in 2013. And that led into some connections with Martin Picard, who studies mitochondrial work at Columbia. And so I'm doing a bit of collaboration there and kind of branching out into all sorts of different domains. So what I was remembering when we jumped on here was that I have a very clear memory of walking back to my house from a train station in Alexandria, Virginia, because before I started my research and PhD with Cliff at UC Davis, I was working at the National Science Foundation, and I was interested in this line of contemplative research. And part of what I was doing to make that decision about whether I would come to Davis or not was listening to podcasts. And you had done an interview with Cliff and one with Catherine McLean. And those were both very salient turning points for me to think about who are these folks that I might be going to work with.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for telling me that story and sharing it again here. And today we're going to be talking about a particular study. And I'm wondering if you could just give us big picture first before we dive in a little bit to what it's about.
Yeah, so we now in the lab refer to this as the CCC study, and that is contemplative coping during COVID-19. And this study really, the beginnings of this study come from about 6 or 7 years ago when we had planned to do a follow-up to one of our retreat studies where we had measured telomere length at the beginning and end of a month-long silent meditation retreat. And one of the pieces of my dissertation was going to be to follow up with the people from that original study using these remote blood collection kits to try to get a sense of whether or not the increases in telomere length that we observed in that original study seemed to be stable across time. And to start to explore whether or not those changes were related to early life adversity, and if people who had experienced more or less early life adversity seem to show any more or less benefit from contemplative training. So that was the idea that had been in the works for a while when the pandemic started to unfold. And so we took what was originally a $20,000 seed grant from the Mind and Life Institute. I had gotten a Varela Award for my original project. And Cliff masterfully uh, connected with a whole lot of philanthropists and donors and foundations who expanded the support for that project by a lot and allowed us to expand the scope to what is now a 4-point longitudinal study that followed people across a year of the pandemic. And so we stuck with the original goal of looking at telomere length, stressors and lifetime adversity and contemplative practice as the kind of core components of that study or this large study now, and also added a lot of measures of what was unfolding during the pandemic, what different people were experiencing during the pandemic. And it's a little bit of a kitchen sink study. We've got all kinds of measures of psychological functioning, well-being, social connectedness, mental health at those time points. So I'll pause there and we can delve into different aspects of that.
Well, there's so much rich content there. I would say it's like a well-stocked kitchen rather than a kitchen sink, as you have a lot of really tasty ingredients to work with in this.
Yeah.
And you mentioned research on telomere length, and I remember this is part of science communication, as you and I have been talking about, that I would see popular journal, popular media articles
Mhm.
with the most outrageous quotes about telomere length associated with long life. And I'm like, well, hang on, this cellular health is a different thing, and in the same way that we can't say what we see at the quantum level doesn't mean you can walk through walls. These are these are things that we don't know quite how that works, and there's some other research to be done on it. But it's good to see that there is hard, measurable science involved with this, that it's not all just self-report. So I'm curious about, with this study, who were the people that were part of the study, and what were some of the highlights that came out of it?
And just to clarify, we're talking about the study during the pandemic and not the retreat study, right?
Correct, correct.
Okay. So, and I asked that partly because for us, this was a new experience for our lab to study something that was not an intensive retreat. And with intensive retreats, you are limited to who signs up for those retreats or who's willing to do a retreat. And so for us, this was a kind of new foray into trying to reach different audiences that we had not previously worked with and during the pandemic. So it was all done remotely. And so there's sort of there's what we wanted to do and what happened and kind of what we learned along the way in that sense. So our goal was to reach a national audience and one that we hoped was representative of folks who meditate in the US. Who are interested in meditation. And our goal within that was to get a broad range of people who practice from different lineages, traditions, secular, not in secular, different levels of experience. So maybe people who had just begun practicing all the way up through folks who've practiced for 40, 50 years. And who engage in different styles of practice. So one way you can think of that is people who maybe do mostly solo practice at home. So there are folks who, have a really regular routine of practicing for X amount of time every morning. There are also people who don't do much regular practice, but will do retreats consistently or frequently, or people who really like to practice with a group, or people who practice with an app. So another sort of goal embedded within this study was trying to get different profiles of different practitioners, people who engage differently and bring that into their lives in different kind of styles and formats.
So what did you find with all of that? Because that's really an interesting distinguishing characteristic about meditators who come to practice and do research is the experience of being in a retreat in a group can be very different when you're maybe a once a week sit by yourself kind of practitioner. And these are
Yeah.
very different things.
Yeah. So one sort of blanket caveat that I will say for the whole study is that I don't have a whole lot to report yet in terms of what we've found that I would stand on. A lot of our energy has gone toward um, one, creating a data visualization app and mechanisms for sharing this data with other researchers rather than analyzing and writing up the data ourselves so far. So we still have plans to do that, and we are in the midst of applying for more grants to support that and to expand our team again. But at the moment, I'll also just kind of couch this in the fact that when this study happened, I was still a graduate student, finishing my PhD and figuring out, where my next steps were going. And Cliff was sort of nearing he's getting closer to retirement. We're not sure he's ever going to retire. He doesn't quite want to, but he kind of wants to. And so we were in this unique position where it wasn't clear that I was going to have a position to support the continuation of this work. And it wasn't clear that he was going to want to continue to support that work in the same way. And so we really made a conscious decision to try to collect this data set and then make it useful to the research field in a different kind of way. So I can say tidbits about who ends up in the study and the things that we can say from the study, but really one of the main outputs from the study so far is this data visualization app that we've created.
Yeah,
And
that's
that
one of
is,
the things that I want to touch on is the little tidbits, yes, but really what I found fascinating about this is one reason Cliff made the connection between you and I is that visualization. And so if you could say a little bit about the tidbits and maybe a little bit more about that additional piece.
yeah. And I will also say just part of the evolution of that decision and the recruitment process and our experience running this study has to do with our shift toward trying to promote and engage in more community engaged research. And so again, thinking back to the recruitment strategy and how that unfolded, um, one of our first moves was to advertise the study through a retreat, an online weekly retreat that John Kabat-Zinn was leading. And so our initial goal was to try to get 300 people to sign up for this study. And through advertising it through John and some other outlets, we also advertised through Spirit Rock because, as I said, our initial goal was to kind of work with people who had done that original retreat study that we had conducted at Spirit Rock, and we wanted to kind of be able to compare to that cohort. But we ended up advertising first through John Kabat-Zinn and got a stunning response. We had 600 people sign up in the first 2 days that we were recruiting people. But what was also very clear was that we were not reaching as diverse a population as we were hoping to. And so that led us to working with different communities, getting different input from different scholars, diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants, and ultimately working with Dr. Camila Majid to really revise our strategy and our materials, our recruitment materials, our study materials, to try to make those more welcoming and inclusive for different groups and to respect people's decisions about what they did and didn't want to participate in. So one of the components initially, willingness to provide a blood sample was a requirement because our goal was to do this study around telomere length, and that was really to follow up on work that we had been doing. And for very legitimate reasons, there are people who don't feel comfortable providing blood samples, DNA to scientists without knowing what it is they're going to do with it and without having some limitations around what they're going to do with it. And so that was a piece that we decided to make optional. And in the end, I don't think that made a huge difference for our study because there were people who wanted to do it and ended up not being able to for various reasons. These remote kits are semi-difficult to collect yourself and return in such a way. And we encountered FedEx delays and various things like that. So that kind of motivation for us to kind of really evaluate how we were going about conducting the study, inviting people into the study, motivated again this kind of idea to move toward more participant engaged research. And so another kind of goal for this data visualization tool was to be able to communicate data back to the participants who engaged in the study. I'm not sure that that's what we achieved. I still think the tool that we created is very researcher oriented because it was created by researchers. And with one of the largest goals being to extend the life of this data and to make it useful to the research community as a whole rather than just to us. And that also comes out of working on some of our ongoing retreat studies where Cliff is a master of creating these really complex field studies where we collect a ton of data and then it takes us time to get that out into the world. So this was an aim at kind of creating a different outlet.
Yeah, and it gives you options on how you can parse that data and different patterns that may emerge that otherwise might have been hidden or never recorded in the first place.
Right.
So with that understanding and the work that you've been doing on this new way to share the information, visualize it, I'm
Mhm.
curious, what are some of the things that for you as you're working on it were like really exciting for you to be able to see as you put data in this and create something that may be setting a direction for how this kind of data is shared? What was that like for you just to see some interesting pieces show up?
Yeah, we've had a great time, and again, this is part of why I think you and Cliff connected around this was because initially he was totally uh could not see why we were going to do this. Why were we going to create this app? Who is this for? What was the use of this? And I think he's the biggest convert now in terms of really having a fun time exploring some of the data. And really from the researcher side, it just speeds things up so much. I mean, obviously a lot of time went into creating and deciding how to do it, but there's so much that we can then explore and kind of look at and more quickly get to what are the things in the study that are really related, interrelated, and tracking together, and what aren't. What are the more kind of unique facets that don't kind of track together? So I'm wondering if you would like to see some of that in the app. I could kind of share screen and show you some of that if you'd like. Okay.
Great, yes.
Um,
Let me turn on the sharing for you.
get to
There
the
you
right.
go. You should be able to share. And thank you for doing that.
Yeah. Okay. There we go.
There
Okay.
you go. Got it.
Yeah, so I'm actually starting here with just our website about the study. So if people are interested in that, we have a lot of materials around what is collected, how that was done, who the team is, that sort of thing.
And
Um,
for those who are watching this, I will have a link to this website where the links are found. So don't worry about writing it down. I've got it for you.
Perfect. And then the way to get to this particular Shiny app that I'm going to show you through this website is from our results. And so we have a link straight to our data visualization dashboard and some acknowledgement of Jen Pokorny, who is the creator of this app. And then if we take a look at the app itself, we've tried to really provide a snapshot. So everything you would find in our scientific publications is, in theory, all here for people to explore, but in a lot of detail. So you could take a look at who was in the study, the different demographics of who ends up in this study, and where they were from. So one of the things that I was going to point out is that we were aiming to get a national sample, but of course, we have a lot more connections in California because that's where our entire team is based. And so we ended up recruiting more heavily from California. This is a bit of a skewed distribution there, but we did end up getting folks from fairly well scattered across the country. And then let's see, one of the things, so under the individual scales, we have really detailed information around almost every single psychological scale or questionnaire that we included in the study, and many, many different ways to visualize those different measures. So the one that I will show you is probably perceived stress, because one of the things that we were really interested in is how stressed were people throughout the pandemic, and what sorts of things were feeding into how stressed people were. So we know that many different communities experience this differently, and that some things became more stressful and some things became less stressful. And we don't quite yet have a good sense of that, but perceived stress was one of the kind of key instruments we were interested in. And we have some different ways of looking at that. And I think, again, so one of the takeaways from this app is that a lot of the things that we expected to see, we didn't necessarily find. And so, for example, these corset plots that you see here are looking at the people who decreased in stress, the people who increased in stress, and the people who did not change from a given time point. So this is across the first 4 months of the study, these changes. So time 1 versus time 2. And essentially what we find is that the same number of people decreased in their stress as increased in stress. So from a researcher's standpoint, if you average all of that, it looks like nothing has changed. But if you look at the individual variation, you actually do see that people are increasing and decreasing in this particular measure. And so that motivates us to then look at what are those individual differences and what's going on for people in those different trajectories.
And I also see as different points in time too. This is just the initial few months of it, but you also have very beginning to the later parts of the study too.
Right. So and that is another piece that is potentially worth maybe backtracking to the timeline of the study at some point, because it is also staggered. People were enrolling at different periods over the time, and so we can kind of look at how things change over time. So another option here is, so yeah, we built that in looking at the scales by time point. So this is called an alluvial diagram. And so that gives you another visual as to how people's stress levels were changing over time throughout this study. So we see that the majority of the participants in the study actually started off reporting relatively low levels of stress. And so stress here being how this particular scale is broken down. So this is kind of broken up into categories that maybe we would debate. But we have the majority of folks in the lower category. Some of those folks end up in okay, this one includes missing data. So another important thing to point out here is that we started with 389 participants who actually began the study, and we definitely had people drop off over time. Some of those folks got COVID and didn't feel up to filling out our questionnaires anymore. Whole different variety of reasons for kind of why lose some folks over time.
Well, and even over time, the things that were changing within the pandemic itself and availability of inoculations and all the rest of that kind of stuff really has an influence in how things are going.
Yes. And so that was a huge piece of our consideration over time and how we continue to try to capture those components throughout this study. So what's really represented in this Shiny app so far is the more standardized questionnaire data, because that's really the kind of easiest to score and make sense of. But what we'll be adding over time is also different measures of for example, so if you remember back to the beginning of the pandemic, and then later that year, we had an election. And so one of the components of this study was to have people fill out a journal entry throughout the week of the top 3 stressors and top 3 supports that they experienced in that week. And we see big shifts that track with what the major societal changes were in a given moment. So we are moving toward developing ways of scoring and summarizing those qualitative responses in a way that we can link with our quantitative data. So we're developing some lexicons to kind of measure more of that and distill all of this down into some more comprehensive analyses, but that's still in the works.
Well, this is a wonderful tool. And again, we're just, for those of you who are watching, we're just seeing a thin slice of how this data can be viewed and the kinds of things that might show up with that.
Yeah.
So if we stop the share here, and Quinn just asking, one of the important aspects that is part of these conversations is that you at this point are at an interesting phase of your career with research and what you're doing. And I'm wondering if, as a kind of last question of our conversation today, if you had any thoughts for people who are earlier, they're coming into this, they're just starting, what are some things you might want to encourage them with about this or let them know?
Yeah. Oh, so at the end of my PhD, I had some conversations with 5 or 6 different folks that I would consider mentors, and far ahead of me in this career path, big names in the contemplative science kind of sphere. And I was really struck by the fact that each one of them had a different suggestion for what I should be focusing on at this stage of my career. They each had a strong opinion about what I should be doing and what I shouldn't be doing. But the thread that was consistent through each of those conversations was that they didn't do what their mentors told them to do. And so I have found that the clearest signal I have in all of this is following my own intuition about what feels important, and then revising that as I get more and more information. So it's led me in some interesting directions, but so far it still feels really like I'm headed in a direction that makes sense for me personally, and kind of the unique combinations of interests I have. So
It's interesting that you bring that up because I've asked that similar question to others, and again, like you, the common thread is I didn't do what was recommended. Part of that is just the changes within the field, within mindfulness.
Yeah.
That once upon a time it was, oh, you don't go into mindfulness. That stuff just is not respected, is not a good territory. And then that has shifted over time to, yeah, there's a lot of work being done on that, and lots of personal experiences too may shade that. So thank you for your willingness to share that. And for those who are watching or listening on whatever platform you're on, I'm going to have some really helpful links for you in the description. So be sure to check those out. Our guest today, Quinn Conklin. Thank you so much for being here, Quinn. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today. I hope you got something out of today's podcast. If you did, please do hit the subscribe button because, again, it helps people to find this and learn more about how mindfulness can play a part in your daily life, whatever it is you're working with. So remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can, and I'll see you soon.